Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tonellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. Cassie Hamer is not only an Australian best-selling author of 3 novels, After the Party, The End of Cuthbert Close and The Truth About Faking It, but a colleague, a writing buddy, and most importantly, a dear friend. Over the years, Cassie and I have shared some incredible experiences together. Most notable, perhaps, is the inaugural Australian Literature Festival at Sea last December. There we hobnobbed with some incredible Australian literary talent, and I got the chance to see Cassie use her incredible skills as an excellent facilitator and host. But today, listeners, I want to tell you all about Cassie's new novel, and it's an absolute cracker. The Stranger at the Table, published by HQ Fiction, is part crime, part family drama that's pacey and page-turning, filled with a cast of flawed but relatable characters and a killer plot twist at the end. The Stranger at the Table heralds an exciting new direction for this best-selling author, and with an endorsement from Australian literary icon Markus Zusak, you know you're going to be in good hands with this story. To say that I'm thrilled to have the chance to chat with Cassie again for the podcast is an understatement. So without further ado, let me say welcome back to the podcast, Cass.
Gee, Claude, that was quite the introduction. I'm thinking we should just end the interview right here because I don't think it's going to get any better than that.
I assure you, my friend, it will get better.
Made me realize we have shared some really interesting experiences together. And to think that really it is through this podcast that we met. And I think the world of what you do, and you really are one of the best interviewers in the business. So it really is a thrill for me to be a guest on the show again.
That's so nice, Cass. Well, the feeling is entirely mutual. And for me, it's an honor to be chatting with you today. So I wanted to ask you, what does it mean to you to be on the cusp of publication of your 4th book? Because as I said, it's a bit of a different direction for you in many ways.
It is a different direction. I think my first 3 books had a certain lightness to them and a humour that I made a deliberate decision to go darker in this 4th book. And that was for a couple of different reasons. One is that I was sort of writing it towards the tail end of COVID, and I just wasn't feeling particularly joyful or in a humorous mood. But the other was that the market really is ripe for darker fiction at the moment. We have an incredible canon in Australia of crime writers, and I wanted to dip my toe into that water.
Indeed, and you have done it with absolute aplomb and style. And hearing that it's a conscious decision on your part was so interesting, because even though your previous books, as you said, had a fairly light tone, I would say that you still dealt with some serious issues in those books.
Yeah, it's interesting. All along, I've been thinking that this book, The Stranger at the Table, is so much darker than the others. But actually, when I look at the previous 3, and particularly the themes around motherhood and the challenges of motherhood, there's a definite consistency to the books. And I would say that parenting and caring for children and family relationships are 100% the itch that I keep scratching. I think all authors have a theme that they go back to. And, there's almost a theory that essentially you rewrite the same book over and over. And I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that definitely the subject matter doesn't deviate hugely from what I've been interested in the whole time.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. So, Cass, for those who are yet to read your story, could you tell me a little bit more about it?
Sure. Well, it does centre around a family gathering where not everyone who sits down for the main course is going to survive until dessert. So we flip sort of between Christmas Day, which is when the gathering is happening, and the few weeks before Christmas leading up to it. And our main character, Marianne, is a very normal mum of 2. She She's a former piano teacher. She's absolutely devoted to her children, but she has a really dark secret, which is that she is an alcoholic, and she committed a terrible crime, a crime that cost two lives, but one that she can't actually fully remember. And this really haunts her. She's desperate to remember the events of the day of the accident. So through the story, we start to find out bit by bit a bit about what happened on that day. But really, she's never going to get to the full truth because there's members of her family who really hold the key to unlocking what happened, and they have some explosive secrets. But her mother, God love her, in her wisdom, Margaret, has decided to invite a stranger to Christmas Day. And this is the Christmas where Marianne is determined to make it perfect. She wants to show her family that she's moved on and that she's in recovery from her addiction. But this stranger, or is he a stranger, is really going to be the one who sets the cat amongst the pigeons, and he's just going to explode everything, and the truth will come out, and someone will end up bleeding and dying at the bottom of Maz's staircase.
Absolutely thrilling. And I just loved every moment of reading this story. So, Cass, where did the idea first come from?
Oh gosh, there are so many, as you know. There's a million and one different ideas that go into writing the book, but essentially it came from a sense of having a slight murderous rage in December. I don't know, I'm sure you're like me, but you get to December and you've just had enough. I'm a mum of three girls, you're a mum of three, so you know what I'm talking about. Everything happens in December. The kids have a million and one end of year things. Everyone's rushing to get their work done. Everyone wants to socialize because it's like we're all going to die on Boxing Day. And then on top of that, a few times I've hosted family Christmases. So not only are you trying to juggle the magic of Christmas for your children and get all the Santa gifts and all of that, you then have to think about putting a hot meal on the table for 20 people, which when you have one oven is like playing Tetris. Now, it's hard to convey just the emotional load of that because when I say it, it's like, oh, well, who really cares if your kids get a present or don't get a present? But I take this very seriously because sometimes I think about my kids 20 years from now, like in a therapy situation, saying, oh, my mum, she was hopeless. She never gave us a great Christmas. So these things really matter to me because they mattered to me as a child as well. I mean, there's not a lot of magic in childhood, but Christmas is one of those things where it is. So I thought, right, okay, I'm feeling really angry about this, that it just comes down to women to make it magical. It's not Santa, it's women the world over. And so I'm going to write about this, but I'm going to write about a woman for whom the stakes of making a perfect family gathering are really high. And I'm going to write about a woman who has a terrible secret that she's trying to run away from. And it's going to be a secret that really explodes during that family gathering. And look, so that's really the starting point for it. But then so much more sort of came into it along the way. The exploration of substance abuse issues, looking at how and why a woman like Marianne ends up in that situation. That was something that also became really important to me. But one sort of fun fact that I haven't really spoken about is that also in the back of my head, I had the sense of writing this as a sort of retelling of the Jane Austen novel Sense and Sensibility, which is really more of a rom-com, but it's about two sisters who are so diametrically different and yet have a huge love between them. Now, I'm lucky enough to have a sister. I have three daughters, so I get to see up close the special nature of that bond and how you can drive each other crazy as sisters. You can be as different, but there's still a level of love and understanding that's extremely powerful. So that was the other element in this book. And my nod to Austen is through the naming of the characters. Marianne is our main character. She's a bit like Marianne from Sense and Sensibility. She's quite flighty and spontaneous. And her older sister, Eleanor, is quite a responsible lawyer. And I just really enjoyed that dynamic and putting that relationship to the test.
So many things in what you've just said that I want to pick up on, but the discussion and the exploration of the sister bond is something that, yes, I mean, you have given a great nod to Austen and the relationship in Sense and Sensibility between Eleanor and Marianne. So let's come back to that. First, I want to talk about Marianne Antonio, or Maz, as she's affectionately referred to by her family in this novel. She's one of several point of view characters in the story, as you've mentioned. She's a woman who, from a very early age, wanted to be a mother, and she was an exceptionally talented pianist, but also an alcoholic, something which seems to run in her family. So tell me about your inspiration for Maz and why this particular aspect of her character was something you wanted to explore in the novel.
Okay, so there's a couple of different reasons that I wanted to look at it. One is that I think I've been on my own journey in the last few years with alcohol. I wouldn't say I've ever been a problem drinker, but it is 3 years now since I had my last drink. And the reasons that I stopped drinking, I'll come back to. I'll go back to the very start. I was very good, very straight-laced child and teenager. Had my first alcoholic drink at Schoolies Week, to celebrate year 12 on the Gold Coast. And it was a Midori and lemonade. And that was the first drink I'd ever had. I was 17. I thought it was quite nice, but didn't drink again. And then went to uni and really did discover a massive drinking culture because I was studying journalism in Bathurst, a country university. Every Thursday and Saturday night involved binge drinking. And when I think about the risks that I opened myself up to then, I'm actually quite horrified. And I do think to a degree that drinking culture among teens of today is slightly different. I still think it happens, but I think it's different. I was part of that generation, really the first generation of women who had complete freedom to drink as we wanted. And now women of my age are getting into their, mid to late 40s, and it's a real sort of crunch point. I think in COVID, I started to find that I did look a bit too much forward to my Friday night pink gins. And at the same time, someone close to me was going through a mental health crisis and started to self medicate with alcohol. And that was devastating to me. This was a really functional, successful person who was in great emotional pain. And so to treat and numb that pain, used alcohol. So, in a way, it's quite rational, really, as a response. The problem being that the ripple effects are enormous and there were children in that household, and I worried enormously for them. And I really started to look at alcohol a different way. And I think bubbling along in the background, I'd sort of, the momentum had started to shift about this mummy wine time culture. I think in the sort of 2010s, it was considered quite funny to post memes about, mummy needs a wine. And I suppose I started to think, is this healthy? And why do we think it's funny that women are under so much pressure that they're needing to have a drug to help them cope with life? And I think at the same time, we've had a rise of some really important spokespeople about women and alcohol. Shanna One, who was nominated for Australian of the Year, who started up an organisation called Sober in the Country, which has really put a spotlight on women and men to a degree, but people in the country who have substance abuse issues. Another woman, Talitha Cummins, a woman of my age, a television reporter who was associated with Hello Sunday Morning. So I think those women have really changed the face of what we think of as a standard alcoholic. It's not necessarily a guy in the street drinking from a paper bag. It can be anyone. It does happen to anyone. And it is an illness. And we need to break the stigma of shame around it. And I was investing all of that into Marianne. But it's a fun book. It meant something to me to say something about this.
And thank you so much for sharing that. I think it is so important to understand that, yeah, there are so many people with high functioning substance abuse problems. And Marianne was certainly one of those people. She functioned well as a mother and a wife, but had this constant underlying habit that really she needed to constantly feed.
Yeah, and I think she is a perfectionist. She had so long wanted to be a mother, and then when she had children, found it was completely different to what she had imagined, found it far more challenging than what she had thought it would be. And really, she had had some problematic behaviors with alcohol before that, but it was really the advent of motherhood that started her on a much more dangerous chapter. And I don't think that's entirely uncommon. I think women are under huge pressure to be perfect mums, perfect wives, partners, and also hold down full time work. It's a real juggle.
Now, Maz is married to a gentleman called Andrew. And by all accounts, Andrew is not only a well respected lawyer, his father was also a highly respected former cop, but Andrew looked after his daughters and he kept his family together while his wife was in prison. As Margie, Maz's mum says, he was a saint. That said, he's exceptionally judgmental of Maz and kind of a bit of a bully in that he never lets her forget about her mistakes. And he doesn't seem to be able to pass up an opportunity to criticize her skills as a parent. Nor is he really in favour of her regaining her memory about what happened on the day of the accident, is he?
No, he's not. And the writing of Andrew went through a couple of different incarnations. Initially, I did have him written as quite a saintly character, and that was something that my editor pulled up on and just got me to massage his depiction a little bit. But I think now he is a much more three-dimensional character. He's not perfect. He also sees himself, though, in a very protective role over Marianne. And I suppose what his characterization shows is that there's two sides to that level of protection in a relationship. It's really hard to talk in a lot of detail about Andrew for reasons I won't go into. But yeah, he was definitely probably the character I had the most difficult time with to get the tone just right.
Yes, he is difficult to talk about without sort of giving away too much about the story, but he was a very interesting character to say the least. The other central figure in this plot is a gentleman called Dominic, who is the son and the uncle of the two victims in the accident which Maz went to jail for. Now, he's a man who suffered his own challenges as a kid and carries a lot of his own trauma and guilt. But the really interesting thing about having Dominic in there was his perspective, because we get to see how he feels about Marianne's release from prison and how victims of crime feel when someone is released back into society after being found guilty of a crime like this one. So I was interested to understand, Cass, how you went about getting inside his head. Did you do any specific research for this part of the narrative?
So one thing about Dominic is that he had a stutter as a child, and that is something that has stayed with him into adulthood. And I think it informs so much of who he is now as a person. He's actually a lovely guy. I had a great time writing Dominic, and I think he's the first male point of view character that I've actually written in any of my books. And so he's definitely an evolved guy. He's not a super macho sort of fella. And yeah, I definitely did want to show how a really innocent, I mean, victims of crime generally tend to be innocent, but he is terrible collateral damage in the crime that Marianne commits. There are certain crimes that I do wonder if forgiveness is ever really possible, particularly in the circumstance where a life has been lost. So, Marianne, it's not like she set out to do what she did, but it happened and the consequences are undeniable. And so, how does Dominic and his family reconcile that? It's easy to paint a portrait of perpetrators of these kinds of victims as monsters. But Marianne is not a monster. She's just a deeply flawed human being.
So, yeah, was there any specific research that you did to kind of get inside his head?
Not so much, other than the stuff around his stutter, but I could pretty well imagine how I would feel in his situation. I think with most characters, there is an adage that there's, when you write a character, that it's one third you, one third someone you know, and one third from your imagination. So in any character I write, there is aspects of me in that. And I think about myself, what if someone had committed a crime that claims the life of my child? How would I feel? We've seen some incredible examples through the media. I'm thinking particularly now of those parents who lost, I think, 3 children in a car accident, probably not dissimilar to Marianne's, to be honest, but they have shown the most incredible compassion and forgiveness for the perpetrator of that crime. And I think driven a lot by their faith. It's part of their faith to forgive. But we live in a pretty secular society. So I think that a lot of people would really struggle for that forgiveness. But the thing about Dominic, and I suppose this happens to a degree in restorative justice programs where perpetrators and victims are brought together to achieve some kind of emotional closure. In this case, Dominic does get the chance to sight Maz eye to eye and see how she's now living her life, see if she has atoned, moved on, managed to kick her alcohol addiction. So it's sort of a wild and chaotic restorative justice session, I suppose.
Okay, so let's talk about Margie. Margie or Margie?
I call her Margie because her name's Margaret.
All right, let's call her Margie. Margie, who is Eleanor and Marianne's mother, is another point of view character, and she's essential in terms of understanding what I kind of called an intergenerational addiction or predisposition, for want of a better phrase. And just like Dominic, Margie has her own guilty secrets, which came as a bit of a shock, I have to say. But when she meets Dominic, she's doing volunteer work, and she has an interesting theory about people who volunteer. Margie says volunteers don't do it because they want to give back. Volunteers volunteer because they feel guilty. And so I had a little bit of a chuckle about that.
I mean, volunteering is a wonderful thing to do, but at the end of the day, no one volunteers without there being some level of personal gratification. Let's be honest, there has to be something in it for us to do it. And I think for me, the two go hand in hand. It is by giving something to the community, I alleviate my own sense of guilt. And maybe it's guilt that I feel like I've been born under a lucky star. I mean, I have a beautiful family. I was raised in, probably the best city in the world, very loving parents, not had huge financial struggles or health battles. I mean, obviously everyone has challenges in their life, and I've had plenty, but that said, I can see comparatively that I'm a really lucky person. And so maybe I do feel a level of guilt about that. And a friend of mine said something interesting to me recently. We were talking, I can't remember what it was about, but she said a line like, if I have a choice between feeling guilty or feeling resentful, I choose guilt because guilt is something that can lessen over time, whereas resentment is something that just builds and builds. So I do feel in a way that I can do something about my guilt, and that's by trying to do something good for the community. And in my case, the main thing that I do, I volunteer at the kids' school, obviously, but privileged kids that aren't exactly in great need of my help. But I do volunteer at Lifeline on the phones as a crisis counsellor, and that again just also makes me realise how lucky I am. I would never use anything I hear on the phones in fiction directly, but it does give me an understanding of suffering, and bringing it back to the book. I have spoken with people in the group of addiction issues, some of whom just have no interest in doing anything about it, and some who are desperately trying to get it under control, and usually for the sake of their family.
The other thing that I really loved about this book was your exploration of how someone like Marianne reintegrates back into their life after being
Mm.
released from prison. Can you tell me a little bit more about this and why this was important to the story?
I really did want to give her a reason to be fearful, in particular, of the people in her new community. So when we meet Marianne, she's relocated the family from Newcastle to Sydney for a fresh start. And because she knows that in Newcastle, which is a small to medium-sized city, that too many people would know her history and that she could never move on from that. And so that's why she moves everyone to Sydney. And then, of course, she's terrified that the mums and dads at her kids' new school will find out what she's done and that the family will be shunned, I suppose, for the mistake that she made. And I think for me, it's actually not that difficult to put myself in that situation because the crime that she commits really is one that any of us could. I mean, I think, I'll put my hand up. There are times, probably in my 20s, when I jumped in a car when I definitely should have not done that. I think all of us are really a lot closer to disaster in a lot of ways than what we realize at any one time. So I put Maz in that situation where she really is trying to run from her past. She's done her time in jail, but I mean, what sort of a prison term could ever really atone for taking two lives? Like there's nothing. How does she achieve self-forgiveness from that? And she just absolutely ties herself in knots trying to achieve it. But I'm not 100% sure it's possible. She just has to learn to live with it as best she can. But actually, I mean, I'm not going to give away the ending, but I can't even talk about it without sort of spoiling things. But there is a big thread there about forgiveness and trying to achieve self-forgiveness and move on.
I mean, a big part of Maz's story is also checking in with her parole officer as well.
Mm,
And so,
yeah.
I was just interested in how you went about bringing that aspect of Marianne's sort of post-prison life to the page.
Yeah, that was definitely an area where I did have to do some research just to get the terminology correct and just to look into what some of the restrictions are around people who have been released from prison. So, for example, Marianne wants to volunteer with a kids' school. And as we all know, that when you want to volunteer with a kids' school these days, you have to do a working with children check. Now, she obviously, if the school checks up on her, that's something that's going to come up. So that's one issue of post prison life. Once you have a criminal conviction, it hangs around you for years and years to come. It restricts your capacity to travel, for instance. And when you're sort of still serving a community corrections order, which is sort of now how they refer to that post jail parole time, it is quite restrictive. You have to share everything, every major change in your life with your parole officer. They have to know who's living in your house, whether you are working. In Maz's case, she has to have a breath testing device fitted to her car, and that has to be checked. So, all those small things, I did research. I'm not going to claim to 100% accuracy, but I look into all of these things as I go. I don't do the research before I begin writing because I could just go down a rabbit hole and disappear. But when I come to something where I just think, oh, this is outside of my own experience, how am I going to find out? That's when I start researching. And it's amazing what you can find. My favorite form of research is to listen to podcasts and to listen to interviews with people who have been through the sorts of things that I'm putting my characters through, because I just think that first person narrative is the key. And what you really want to find out is not just the nuts and bolts of how things work, because obviously that's important to authenticity, but just little nuggets about how it feels, I suppose. And that's where interviews and first person accounts are so useful.
Yeah, fantastic. As mentioned earlier, Maz is keen to get to the bottom of what exactly happened the day of the accident, but she hasn't had any real luck remembering and turns to hypnotherapy as a tool to help fill in the blanks. So, I mean, please tell me you offered yourself up as a guinea pig and underwent hypnosis.
Sadly, I didn't, but that's a good idea. But I did the next best thing and I watched a proper hypnotherapy session because no, I've never done it. I'm a bit scared of it, to be honest. It's funny, you say hypnotherapy now, I think we all conjure up visions of those sort of theatrical stage performances where a guy clicks his fingers and people just close their eyes and then they start quacking like ducks and, pretending to be chickens on a stage. That's not the form of hypnotherapy at all. Like, it is a recognized treatment for, well, when I say recognized, I mean it can be quite a useful treatment for people with a whole range of problem behaviors. So I actually did have a school mum friend who went into hypnotherapy, and she was telling me about just the different types of things that she would treat. For instance, if you're a smoker, that was something she could help with. It was really just about sort of disrupting behaviors and getting out of established patterns, I think. So no, I really enjoyed writing that.
Cass, we've covered so much ground already and, gained some wonderful insight into the reasons why you explored certain themes and issues in this book. But there was one particular quote at the end of the book, and I think it's Marianne who says this, but she says, quote, secrets were the kindling to the bonfire of her shame.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
I've been thinking about that quite a bit today, actually. I honestly think that shame is perhaps the most insidious of all the emotions. It eats away at your insides, and usually it does relate to an aspect of yourself or your personality that you're trying to hide. And that's where the idea of secrets and shame being quite intrinsically linked come from. And I think the point with Marianne and the point that I would make for all mental illnesses, because I do think that substance abuse falls into that category, is that it is an illness. And sadly, some people do feel shame about it in a way that they wouldn't feel if it was an illness, for example, like cancer. So people who suffer from these illnesses judge themselves often very harshly. And society around them, I think, is getting better at withholding judgment, but we're still not there yet. And the antidote to shame is honesty and transparency and asking for help and knowing that you're going to be met with kindness and a lack of judgment.
There's a wonderful phrase that somebody said that sunlight was the antidote to.
Yeah,
I can't even
like
think what it
sunlight
is now.
sort of the cure, or something about the cracks let in the light.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. Anyway, I mean, I spoilt the moment, but but you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean. I think, secrets, particularly family secrets, do have a way of worming into the light, and often at the least convenient times. I mean, every single one of us has secrets. I've got secrets. I'll probably go to the grave with a few. I'm not that great at keeping them, but I'm getting better. I think I'm getting less gossipy, I think, with age, and hopefully less judgmental, I suppose. But I really would love us to live in a world where we talk about depression, bipolar, schizophrenia in the same way that we talk about cancer, kidney disease, heart disease, just as problems to be treated and not fundamental personality flaws.
Cass, I wanted to talk about structure. In this book, you've got a forward moving timeline that sort of starts before Christmas and goes forward. But then we have flashbacks, and those flashbacks can be in different points of view. It's a very complex structure, but I think you've used it to really great effect. And I wanted to ask you, was this planned or was it more of an ad hoc thing?
So it was planned to a degree. This book was a little bit, it was both planned and a little bit haphazard. For memory, what I did with the flashback stuff is that I actually wrote it as one big clump, not really knowing how or whether it would be used, but knowing that for people to understand Maz and to sympathize and empathize with her, they would have to understand how she got to that point, because on the face of it, what she's done is so terrible. And I really didn't want the reader to judge. So, what I think I did in the end was that I wrote this puddle of backstory, started to chop it up, wrote the front story sort of separately to that, and then in the editing process, wove them in together, which then required a bit of massaging of the front story to make it seem like a natural flashback. But it's a technique that I've seen lots of other authors use. Nicola Moriarty does it, Sally Hepworth does it. And I do think it's particularly effective and not confusing to the reader if it's signposted sufficiently. And if you make it interesting enough, it can really just give a lot more texture and understanding to the characters in the story. But the other bit I really enjoyed is that the book opens with a prologue, which is Christmas Day, and it's from the point of view of the paramedics who turn up at Maz's home, and they're the ones who are called to treat the body lying at the foot of the stairs. And then sprinkled throughout the story, we jump forward a bit to Christmas Day on a few occasions, and we see Christmas Day from the point of view of the people who work on Christmas Day. So from the paramedics, we then go into the hospital where there's a doctor who's treating the person who's gone down to the bottom of the stairs. And then we see the policeman who's called out to go and attend to Marianne's house to investigate it. And I just, I worked as a journalist once in TV. So I did work on a few Christmas days. And it's a really strange experience to be working on a day where everyone else is with their family. And that was one aspect of the writing that I just had a lot of fun with, just showing what it's like to be actually in the emergency services on a day like that, because it's a crazy day. You're working with the skeleton staff and you've got people who are just drunk as sailors, families getting together, kids riding on new scooters and rollerblades. It's just a recipe for a really busy time. And I just thought it'd be something a bit different to put in as well.
Yeah, as I said, a complex structure, but used to really great effect. And we get to see the lead up to the incident in question from all different points of view. And I found that incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, that last sort of 80 pages really gallops along, and that's the feedback I'm getting when people get to that point where, the front story meets up with the current story, that it gathers a lot of momentum, and that for me, like the ending almost felt like it was writing itself. I haven't had many experiences like that, but that was one of them where it just felt like everything fell into place.
Yeah, so great to hear that, because my next question was going to be, did you find this story more difficult to write than your others?
Funnily enough, I mean, they're all hard to write. Like, that goes without saying. Just because you know how to write one book doesn't mean that you know how to write the next book. And the writing of a new book always begins with me Googling, how do I write a book? Because one book does not teach you the next. But I have to say, in terms of difficulty, I actually do think this one was at the slightly lower end of it. Hard to say why. I mean, maybe it's because for the first time I was writing in first person, which is a change up for me. It's something that I haven't done in any of my books. And that was because it's so silly. So I did a Masters of Creative Writing at uni, and I'll never forget this one lecturer, very snobby, was teaching narrative theory, said words to the effect of, that he considered that first person present tense to be just the lowest of the low forms of writing. And it's funny how those comments, those sort of slightly gendered, I feel, to be honest, or definitely snobbish against commercial fiction, because a lot of commercial fiction is in that first person present tense these days. Those comments really sit in your brain like a little seed, a little weed, I should say, and they sprout. But for this one, I actually thought that it would really work for Marianne because she's very honest, I think, with the reader. She's trying to get to a truth that she doesn't actually know. So if I'd written her, if I'd written her in first person and she had full awareness of everything that had happened on the day of her accident, it wouldn't really have worked because I would have had to tell the reader straight up what had happened. And so that was just going to ruin everything. So in a way, I do feel like first person really works for a character who doesn't quite have all the pieces of the puzzle, because then you can see it through their eyes as they start to get more bits of information. But honestly, as far as this one goes, yeah, the structural edit wasn't horrendous. None of it has been overly difficult. I feel almost terrible saying that because maybe it's like childbirth and you just forget the pain. I think I've just blocked the pain, to be honest. I'm sure it was awful at the time, but now in hindsight, when I look at the finished product, I'm like, oh, yeah, it wasn't that bad.
Well, that's great because it'll mean you'll keep continuing to write stories.
Oh, no, because see, now I'm in the depths of drafting my next book and it's awful. Like, it's just the worst feeling. I feel so incompetent at some points, and just like I just wish my brain was better and more efficient and smarter. That's the only part of my life where I really feel quite intellectually incompetent at times, and it's terrible, but I just stick that voice on my shoulder and like, well, I'm going to do it anyway. It might be crap, but I'm blazing forward because it's the only way. You can't let the voice of fear and doubt win, because you would never get a book out there. So I'm just ignoring it.
Well, I certainly hope you do, my friend, because there's nothing intellectually deficient about you or your writing or your books.
Oh God, I don't know. I just wish I was a genius sometimes, a genius with a memory that just could encapsulate everything. Because honestly, you live in your everyday life, and so you've got this life in your head, and there's a million and one things going on. It's like adding a second whole world or a second whole life into your brain. And sometimes mine just feels like it's going to explode, because one life is hard enough, but living two lives sometimes feels impossible.
Now, I want to talk about Markus because you and I both have had the pleasure of meeting him, but I wondered how him giving you a testimonial for your book came about because I think it's marvelous.
Well, I just asked him. I felt absolutely dreadful doing it because he's so well known and so successful. And I have no doubt that he gets millions of these requests, but he's just too nice to say no. And so we'd been in touch because I had the privilege of interviewing him at a Dimmick's literary lunch, and he's a delight. And he made the mistake of putting his email address inside the cover of the book that he signed for me. I'm sure he never thought that I would hit him up for an endorsement, but you know what? My publisher said, look, it would be really great if you could get some good endorsements for this book. And I thought, right, okay, who is the most famous author I know? So I just thought, you know what? The worst that can happen is that he says no and that he's too busy. And I went into it thoroughly expecting that that is what he would say. But honestly, the man is too nice. And so he kindly read it. And I was quite shocked that he did end up supplying the endorsement. It sort of came at the 11th hour, just before the cover was going to be finalised. And as soon as the publisher saw it, I think they thought, right, front cover, top centre, featured. So yeah, the poor man, I said to him, look, this is a one and done scenario. I'll never ask you for this again, but on this occasion, would you mind? And yeah, honestly, the guy's inhumanly polite.
On that, I agree. He is very polite, but I'm sure that if he didn't like the book and he didn't feel like he could reasonably put his name to it, he wouldn't have done it. So
I don't know.
kudos to you, my friend.
Maybe he might also know that we don't live that far apart from each other, so he would have suffered the indignity of probably running into me at some point and having to explain himself. But honestly, I never take offense when people say they can't read a book, because I know how long it takes, and I've done it for other authors. It's a big commitment to make. I mean, time is precious. We don't have many reading hours in the day, and to give it to a fledgling author like me is a really generous thing to do.
Well, I think it's very well deserved, my friend, and take it.
I am, don't worry.
Oh, Cass, it's always such a pleasure chatting with you about your work. I'm so proud of you, and I wish you every success with it. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Claudine, as always, it's been fantastic. I always say that you ask the best questions, and it's true. You really do. You read thoroughly, you think about it, and that's why you generate such great conversations. So thank you for your time and effort.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading!